Hey everyone online. Cool. Everyone online, can you hear us? Any confirmation from someone? Yes, okay, thanks, Dan. All right, well, thanks for coming to seminar today. I have a couple of announcements before we get started. Students, you should have received a call to apply for our lightning talks and poster session that happened on December 8th of this quarter. If you didn't, let me know. We can send you an email. Applications are due next Friday, and you don't have to have the poster done. You need a title and an abstract. So go ahead and apply, and then you have a little while to get it done. We also are in the middle of our introduction to our workshop series. So we have the first one on Tuesday. Next week, we have one on Wednesday on manipulating data. So please register for that if you're interested. And I'm about to introduce Dr. Mike Spencer, the Dean of the School of Social Work. But for those of you online, remember if you have questions to use the Q&A function, not the chat. Yeah, all right, take it away. Thank you. Here.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me here today and to introduce Christian. I was actually a presenter last year to this group, and it was a very friendly group, and I really appreciated all the great questions that y'all had. So I'm sure that you folks will enjoy this talk today. I'm here to introduce Christian Jones, who will be speaking today on uncovering the precursors of change, examining cross-racial youth mentoring relationships between non-Black mentors and Black youth. Christian Jones, PhD, is an assistant professor at the University of Washington in the School of Social Work. His program of research examines how youth mentoring relationships can be utilized to prevent adverse outcomes and promote positive strengths in Black youth. As a Black male scholar, his research is grounded in his passion for equity and inclusion, specifically as it relates to marginalized youth and their families. Prior to being a faculty member, he worked as a foster care counselor at youth villages in Cooksville, Tennessee, and as a community support therapist in Stone Mountain, Georgia. He received his PhD in social work from the University of Texas at Austin, his master's degree in counseling from Boston University, and bachelor's degree in psychology from Albany State University in Albany, Georgia. Before I turn the floor over to Christian, though, I just want to say that I met Christian over a Zoom call, and in the background, my wife was doing her thing, but she could hear what was going on in our conversation, and she knew I was recruiting him for a job, and she said, "Who's that guy?" I said, "Oh, his name's Christian Jones. He's from the University of Texas." She said, "You need to hire him." And she knows nothing about social work. But she's like, "You need to hire him." I'm like, "Really? Why?" I said, "I want to hire him too, but yeah, I want to know why you want to hire him." He just sounds like a really nice guy. Sounds like someone who's just going to really, bring the school together, and someone who's going to just, want to help us achieve our mission here at the school. And you know what? She was absolutely right. She was absolutely right. I don't know how she knew that, but she was absolutely right. This person has been the glue in our school over the past years as a new professor. Everyone wants a piece of him, and I'm trying to keep fighting people off. But everyone wants a little bit of Christian, and so I'm real glad that you all get a piece of him today. But leave him alone after this, right? Let him do his work. No, I'm just kidding. Of course, Christian always makes his time for everyone, and that's why he's such a special guy. And so, and none of that just speaks to his scholarship, which is outstanding. We're so lucky to have Christian. And with that, I'll just turn the floor over. Thank you.
So I hope I live up to the hype. I feel like I'm the first round draft pick, and I need to debate. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for taking the time to come to my presentation. Again, my name is Christian Jones. Today I'm going to be talking about uncovering the precursors of change, examining cross-racial youth mentoring relationships between non-Black mentors and Black youth. And to begin the conversation, I'm actually going to start with an opening reflection. I'm very fortunate to teach at the University of Washington, and I like to start every class with an opening reflection. And I will ask one person to participate if they feel so willing to do so. Then I'm going to briefly talk about why I study mentoring and why I'm so passionate about it. Then I'm going to go into some of the background in terms of the youth mentoring research and the type of gaps I was trying to fill in this study. Then talk about my research aims, the guiding research question, the methodology I used and why I picked that methodology for this specific study, the resulting framework. So I used a grounded theory methodology. So I ended up creating a framework. So I will preface this by saying I'm not an artist. So please don't judge the framework and how it looks. Then we'll talk about some results. Specifically, I'll read some quotes from the dissertation study, then talk about discussion and hopefully get into some of the implications of the study. So if you all could just take a few seconds and think about a mentor that has positively impacted your career or in your personal life, and then what's the biggest lesson you've learned from that mentor? Do I have a brave soul that's willing to share a mentor that's had a huge impact on them? Well, first of all, before we do that, by show of hands, how many of you have had an influential mentor? So those of you all on Zoom, everyone raised their hand in this room, and that's a great segue into why I study mentoring. But anyone willing to share why or someone in their life that had a huge impact on them as a mentor? I don't believe in cold calling, so yes.
My master's advisor. I come from first gen college family. I don't know why I was in a master's. I didn't know how people became professors. I didn't know what this job was. She was the person who encouraged me to do a PhD, even though I still didn't really know what the job was. But yeah, I'm here because she kept going.
Thank you for sharing that. So mentors can have a huge impact on us in a variety of different ways, whether it's having someone that looks like you, whether it's having someone give you an opportunity that you felt like you weren't ready for, but that person saw something in you that you didn't see in yourself. Mentorship, I would argue, is at the core of our success for everyone. So I study mentoring for a few different reasons. We'll start on the right. The picture's a little blurry, but this is my last day of my internship when I was a master's student at Boston University. And the kids I worked with threw me a surprise going away party. So I got to see firsthand how powerful it is to invest in people and see those investments bear fruit. Due to trials and tribulations, people not listening. Everything is always so worth it when you're investing in someone, and it's nothing like see someone else achieve their goal. Now on the right, this is one of my favorite mentors next to Dean Spencer, Dr. Chantel Crosby at the University of Louisville. Was absolutely pivotal in helping me graduate from the University of Texas. Getting a doctorate was the hardest thing I've ever done. It's pretty rough. So if anyone is thinking about doing it, please reach out to me so I can give you some tips. But she just helped me in ways that I didn't even realize that she was helping me in terms of putting me on projects before I realized how important that was, in terms of just phone calls of affirmations when I felt like I didn't belong in the school. So I've been very blessed to have incredible mentors, and I've also been blessed to mentor other people. And I can say from my research and from personal experience, mentoring is just so powerful. And it really is why I'm so passionate about it. I believe everyone deserves a great mentor. And I believe everyone has the capacity to be a great mentor. Now, specifically, I study youth mentoring relationships, and more specifically, volunteer programs like Big Brothers Big Sisters. And these programs have been along since the early 1900s, but really started to become really popular in terms of research field in the mid 1990s. In the literature, it's shown that mentoring programs can promote a variety of different outcomes. So whether it's social emotional outcomes, academic outcomes, social emotional well-being, research shows time and time again that mentoring programs are very effective in promoting positive outcomes for youth, specifically youth who are vulnerable for a variety of different reasons. Now, it's important to acknowledge that while mentoring programs are very effective, the effect sizes are pretty small to medium, and that could be for a few different reasons that we'll get into during this conversation. Now, as you can see on the left, the majority of youth who receive mentoring and community-based youth mentoring programs like Big Brothers Big Sisters identify as BIPOC, and more specifically, Black youth make up the largest racial demographic, whereas on the right side, the large majority of mentors who volunteer their time for organizations like Big Brothers Big Sisters identify as white. And just some more recent data in terms of what the demographics look like for youth who are in programs like Big Brothers Big Sisters. Again, the large majority of youth identify as BIPOC, with that largest individual racial demographic being Black youth. And while Black youth make up the largest demographic of youth, the overwhelming largest demographic of mentors identify as white, and specifically female. So I was really interested in these cross-racial mentoring relationships, but more specifically, I was really interested in how mentors talked about issues centered around race, social justice, racism, and supported youth. So while there's a lot we know about youth mentoring, there's a lot we don't know. So in terms of what happens in a youth mentoring relationship, like I said before, we know that youth mentoring is a very effective intervention, but we don't really know what's happening in the relationship that's causing those positive outcomes. Is it the amount of time the mentor is spending with the youth? Is it catching the youth at a vulnerable time in their life? Is it celebrating the youth's strengths? We're still trying to figure out what is in the secret sauce that makes youth mentoring such a great intervention. It's also unclear how youth mentoring programs cultivate racial identity and ethnic identity of youth. And this is really important because tons and tons and tons of research has shown racial identity is really pivotal for youth of color, and specifically for Black youth can act as a protective factor and a promotive factor for positive outcomes. And it's unclear how youth mentoring programs promote social justice in the communities that they serve. And along those lines, considering the racial demographics of those who have the capacity or have the time to mentor, it's unclear how mentors analyze their own positionality, their own privileges, whether that be white privilege, class privilege, ableism, gender privilege. And it's really unclear how mentors interact with the youth's family, specifically from a cross-racial perspective. So to fill those gaps, my study was really focused on examining what are the factors that lead to these positive outcomes, specifically in these cross-racial mentoring relationships, since they're so common. I was really interested in learning how mentors acknowledge the racial identity of Black youth and what that looks like in the mentoring relationship. I was really interested in how mentors talked about different social justice topics, whether it's police brutality, mass incarceration, very specific issues that impact the youth that they work with. And again, really interested to really analyze how mentors analyze their own privilege as a result of working with a youth of a different cultural, ethnic identity background in them. I'm really interested in how mentors connected with the youth's family. So my guiding research question was, what are the potential precursors of change that mentors consider are likely to promote positive youth development outcomes among Black youth engaged in mentoring programs? So in English, I was just really interested in what was happening in these relationships that help promote positive outcomes. So I utilize a qualitative method, specifically a grounded theory, and more specifically a constructivist grounded theory. And I'll talk a little bit more in a second why I use constructivist grounded theory specifically. So as much as I tried to run from it, I was really intimidated by using a grounded theory. You have to use the method that answers the question that you're answering. So despite my hesitancy, I ended up using grounded theory and I made it to the other side. And I had the opportunity and really the privilege of talking to 28 mentors across the country. And I'll talk a little bit more about them in a second. So I want to give a huge shout out to Dr. Brett Fields. He's the former CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters of Central Texas, located in Austin. Without him, I probably wouldn't have graduated. I went to his office, gave him my dissertation idea, and he supported it 110%, gave me some feedback on it, helped me recruit for the study. I also have to give a huge shout out to Dr. David Dubois at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He has a youth mentor and listserv, and I was able to recruit people through the youth mentor and listserv. And I talked to both current and former mentors who mentored for Big Brothers Big Sisters, specifically mentors who didn't identify as Black, who worked with Black youth. Well, like I said, I talked to people from around the country, with most of them being in Texas, but got to talk to people who lived in Alaska, North Carolina, Michigan, Illinois, Tennessee. And all of it was very interesting to see how different mentors handle different situations based upon their geographic location, based upon their program norms. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when I show you all the diagram that I made. And thankfully for me, all interviews could take place via Zoom and phone call, which was really helpful in helping me graduate on time. So I use in-depth, semi-structured interviews with an interview guide with these big overarching questions that had little probing questions under them. Most of the conversations were around an hour to 2 hours, with a few conversations being as long as 3 hours. People were very generous with their time and had a lot to say. And I could see some of them processing this stuff in real time. And I believe I got some really incredible insight on some pretty sensitive topics. Now, in terms of the demographics, the large majority identified as non-Hispanic white. One of those mentors also identified as American Indian, and then two other folks identified as other. The gender demographics were pretty evenly split. The majority of the mentors were between 45 and 54 at the time of the study. All of them had some type of education after high school, with the large majority of them graduating with their bachelor's degree. Majority of them were married at the time of the study, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And to my surprise, most of them had a lot of experience working with Black youth, specifically more than 2 years of experience. So as I mentioned before, constructivist grounded theory was really foundational to this study, because this version of grounded theory really encourages the researcher to really own their positionality and let that inform their data analysis. So me being a Black male, everyone who knows me knows I'm from Marietta, Georgia, and being a Southerner is something that has a huge impact on my identity. At the time that I did this study, I was in my late 20s, from a middle-class background, and have a lot of experience working with youth. And I think I can speak for everyone when I say 2020 was a rough year for all of us for a lot of different reasons. The political election, COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, all of the racism that was exposed in our systems that we may have thought were gone, that really came to light during 2020 pandemic. And all of those factors had a huge impact on how I perceived the data, how I perceived mentors, how they perceived me, and had a huge impact on how I analyzed the data. Now, for the data analysis, I read and reread transcripts constantly. The great thing about constructivist grounded theory is that you can start coding right away, which is really helpful. So I could graduate while I still had funding. So I conducted initial coding to begin with. And then from those initial few transcripts and interviews, I was able to develop some theoretical sampling, which is just me like being intentional on asking certain questions when certain themes are starting to emerge, and have that inform the interview guide and my code book that I would later make. Once consistent code started to emerge between the different transcripts of interviews, I was able to make a code book. And then the next step from initial coding is focus coding. And then that's just identifying these major themes, these major categories. I was able to take those themes and start to construct the framework that you all are about to see. Memoing, just taking notes was absolutely essential during this process. Like I said, it was a rough time for all of us. So spent a lot of time reflecting, a lot of times kind of questioning my own prejudices, my own biases, my own assumptions of different topics in this study. So I grew a lot as a person throughout this research project. And I was able to integrate these different categories into this framework. And I reached a theoretical saturation at 23 interviews. So I was able to see no new major codes or themes at 23 interviews, and conducted 5 more interviews for any outliers. So like I said, I'm not an artist, but I'm gonna run through this really quickly with you all. So the first category, mentors' motivations, their values and life experiences. So that's essentially what the mentor brings to the relationship. Every person that I talked to said that they wanted to make a difference. They had the time to make a difference. So that's why they wanted to be a mentor. In terms of factoring personal experiences in the mentor's life, one of the mentors talked about them being a military brat and that informing how they interacted with people, whereas some mentors talked about being single, have time to mentor, and then they get married during the relationship, and then that impacts the youth mentor relationship. Then they have kids, and then that impacts the youth mentor relationship. So in some ways, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but you see this arrow coming back. Some of the youth in the program got to see their mentors grow up, which is something I didn't think about before the study. That was really cool. And then that last subcategory of the first category, growing as a part of the mentor relationship, that was the biggest takeaway from this study, just how adamant mentors were that this was the best experience of their life, besides having kids and getting married, but close third, and just how much they gain from this experience. The mentoring program components, a lot of mentors talked about how Big Brothers Big Sisters does a phenomenal job of screening and matching them. And a lot of them felt like they didn't really have to work that hard to build rapport with their youth because they felt like they had a lot in common with them. They also shared the same dislikes. In terms of supporting mentors throughout the relationship, Big Brothers Big Sisters has a lot of resources, more than a typical mentoring program. So they're able to have match support specialists and hold events to support mentors and their youth. And policies and procedures also impacted the relationship. One mentor told a story about how he was allowed to go on these camping trips with his youth, and his youth loved them. But then something changed in the organization and stopped allowing these camping trips, and the mentor was not happy about that and spent a lot of time complaining about that during our conversation. And the third category, engagement with the youth, this is just establishing that relationship, growing it, and maintaining it when things happen, which is why you see an arrow going back and forth, the youth's intro into personal factors. So things that they have going on in their life that impacts the relationship, connecting with the youth's family and social network. Most mentors reported a really close relationship with the youth's family, with a few reporting some difficulties and how it took a long time for the caregivers or the family to trust them as outsiders, looking after or mentoring their child, engaging in activities. A number of mentors were able to expose their youth to different things that they hadn't been exposed to before, which was great. and addressing racial and social topics. And then that goes directly to the next category, recognizing the youth's personality, their strengths, their age. Developmental age was huge in this study. Every single mentor agreed they had to work harder to keep their youth's attention once they became a teenager, and would have to get more creative, like, hey, let's go to the mall, or like, hey, I'll take you shopping, just hang out with me. Gender was also really important, and I'll give a specific example about that in just a second. Recognizing the youth's racial experiences in their life. So for example, there were some mentors who told stories about their youth reporting times they felt discriminated against, or they felt there was a racist action towards them, and that obviously impacted interactions in a relationship. All mentors talked about the importance of the youth's family dynamics and how that would impact their mentor relationship. And the biggest thing to consider for the social environment factor, every single mentor that I talked to voiced extreme displeasure with the youth school system, and in that causing a lot of reflection within them in terms of the type of school they were able to go to, and their frustration with the type of education their mentee was receiving. And last but certainly not least, you have positive outcomes. So that's witnessing these really huge accomplishments in the youth's life. So whether it's graduating from high school, some people got to see their youth get married as an adult. Some people got to be there when the youth had their first child. And then leaving that lasting impression, a lot of mentors talked about receiving messages from youth years later, thanking them for their time and thanking them for the things that they did for them, and becoming like family. This was a pretty big surprise for me. A lot of stories that sounded like something out of a Disney Channel movie, but a lot of I'd say most of the mentors I talked to didn't say like, oh, my mentee this or my mentee that. They would say my little brother, my little sister. They were just kind of like an extended family member, which I thought was really powerful. And the positive outcomes could look something like grappling with your white privilege for the first time and having that newfound social awareness. Or it could be like, I went to my first Black cookout. It was great. Really enjoyed myself, and getting exposed to different cultural events, activities that you wouldn't have been able to be exposed to beforehand. So I'm going to read some quotes really quickly from the study. So this specific quote, a mentor told me about a time that the youth disclosed just perceived discrimination. So this quote reads, one time he called me from jail, he got arrested. His story was like any high school kid. He was like, me and a buddy got pulled over and we had some weed and the cop arrested us. His perspective was definitely, if I was white, that wouldn't happen. And this specific mentor really went into detail about feeling conflicted on like, how do I support someone when they have this experience that I just cannot relate to at all? And what does that look like? And really grappling what's the best way to support someone who has such a different lived experience than you. So I appreciate their vulnerability and really grappling with what's the best way to support someone when they have specific identities that have a huge impact on their lives that they themselves can't relate to. So a lot of mentors talked about these specific conversations that were specifically based around race that had a huge impact on the mentoring relationship. So this mentor talked about a time that, well, not she has the word for it, code switching, and she noticed her mentee talking differently with her family than she did with her, and it brought on a really big conversation with them. The quote reads, my mentee said, well, I don't talk with you like I do at home. And I said, what do you mean? She gave me examples in that same day. I had to take her home to her aunt's house. We knocked on the door and I heard what she was talking about. And I was just flabbergasted. It brought on a big conversation between us. So interestingly, this wasn't the only mentor who identified code switching between the youth in terms of like how they talked with the mentor and how they talked with their friends or family members. And with all of them, it brought on a really interesting conversation around racial differences and culture and all that good stuff. So only a small subsection of mentors engaged in activities specifically based on their youth's racial identity, but the ones that did did a really creative and phenomenal job centering the youth's racial identity in certain activities. So this quote reads, "It was interesting because one of the things I made a point of doing was watching a movie with mentees named that was all about racism with a Black hero." Other mentors talked about giving you specific books on historical figures based on their racial identity. Other mentors talked about going to museum exhibits or like, hey, have you heard of this person? Like, let's do some research about them. So it was only a small subsection of mentors who did this, but the ones who did do it, I thought were very intentional about it. So as I said before, 2020 was a rough year, and a lot of mentors talked about that during these conversations. And a lot of them just straight up said, like, yeah, I didn't really think about this or talk about this before the actions that happened in 2020, whether it was the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, whether it was a documentary they saw. 2020 was a big racial awakening for them, and it impacted relationships they had in the mentoring relationship. So this quote reads, "I wouldn't say that mentees name and I really address racial topics often. I think the only time we've talked about it directly was relatively recently this year with the protests against police brutality." And for the mentors who did bring up the current social climate, they reported that the youth appreciated having that space to talk about those issues. Now, along with thinking about the social climate, some mentors did teach tangible strategies to deal with oppression, and specifically all of it built around interactions with the police. And a lot of mentors talked about their fear of their mentee being harmed due to police interactions. And this quote reads, "Well, I've talked to them about how to act if they're in a car, and if they get pulled over by the cops, or if they're just out on the street and a cop stops them." Interestingly, for this specific sub-theme, all the mentors who talked about strategies in terms of dealing with the police officers, all of them worked with Black boys and young men. None of the mentors that mentored girls, young women, non-binary folks identified talking to their youth about interacting with the police, which I thought was really interesting that this one had such a gendered component to it. So as I mentioned before, so many mentors talked about how much they learned from the experience of being a mentor, specifically around different privileges that they had. So to provide a little context to this quote before I read it, this mentor is talking about a time he took his mentee out for a drink once the mentee turned 21, not before, and just being really blown away from that conversation years later. When you're having a beer and someone tells you what they're grateful for, "Oh, I'm grateful that I'm not in prison. I'm grateful that I graduated from high school." Those weren't the top things that I thought of when I turned 21. So a lot of mentors talked and really grappled with this newfound social awareness of different privileges they had and what to do with that awareness. Now, some mentors, about 8, were pretty adamant that race wasn't important in the relationship and nothing would be different if they mentored white youth versus Black youth or youth of any other racial background. And this is a quote from a mentor discussing a time that their mentee discussed the time that they felt like they were being discriminated against. She was driving this big red truck, and then she was saying that the cop pulled her over because she was Black. And I was like, no, the cop pulled you over because you probably couldn't even see him because you were switching lanes illegally. So some of the findings of the study really address specifically the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th aim of my study. So we really need more universal and uniform ways to talk about social justice, specifically social justice trainings for mentors or working with youth of different racial, ethnic, class backgrounds in their own. There's not a lot of intentional racial identity cultivation in these relationships. And this one has sparked a lot of reflection in me. I used to think like, oh, of course, like mentors should be talking about these issues. But now it's like, oh, well, should they? If you don't do it well, should you talk about those issues? And that's still something I'm still struggling with. And then for some of the mentors, it was just a lack of awareness of any type of institutional and structural factors that impacted the youth circumstance that they worked with. So some pretty significant limitations. Big Brothers Big Sisters was the only agency I worked with for this study. And that's really important to acknowledge because Big Brothers Big Sisters has a lot of resources. So their framework might look differently if I worked with a different mentoring program. There could be potential presence of recall bias. I talked to some mentors who mentored in the mid-90s, early 2000s, and definitely social desirability, wanted to seem like they were the best mentor of all time. All participants were definitely not exposed to the same level of training at Big Brothers Big Sisters. And I didn't interview Black youth or mentors for this specific study. So going forward, I would love to interview Black youth and specifically Black mentors who mentor for Big Brothers Big Sisters. I'll talk really briefly about the work I've been able to do since I've been in Seattle. And one of my most positive, or definitely my favorite memory here, was working with Black youth and interviewing them for Seattle Public Schools. We need more social justice trainings and mentoring programs or community-based programs, period, should really think about collaborating with different people in the community to create a village of mentoring. So using barbershops, beauty salons, community centers, and partnering together. And I really would love us to reframe youth mentoring research. It's often posed as this all-knowing person who comes and works with this marginalized youth. And the youth, they have a lot to offer, they have a lot to give, they have a lot of value. And the mentor grows a lot from the experience as well. So thankfully, all the papers from this dissertation have been published. Reviewers were really rough on me to begin with, but was able to get it together. So I'm really grateful for that because like I said, getting a PhD was so difficult. I had to get at least one to make up for all the late nights. And like I mentioned before, I've been able to do some really amazing projects in Seattle. I've worked with Kingmakers of Seattle, specifically doing an evaluation of their program. And going to Aki Karosi in South Seattle and having a class give you applause because you're a professor that works at the University of Washington. I felt like I made it at that point. Like you can't really tell me anything after that. I've been able to work with Friends of the Children and Social Development Research Group. This specific study has been really cool. I've been able to talk to young adults who are a part of this mentoring program. So that's been a lot of fun. And Friends of the Children is really unique because it's a longitudinal mentoring program. So kids start when they're 5 years old and typically, hopefully they stay in until they're 18. So it's really interesting talking to young adults. And then I just started working with the Firearm Injury Prevention and Research Program. I'm really interested in trying to use youth mentoring as a way to prevent firearm violence. But that's a very new research interest for me. So y'all wish me luck on that. So really thankful for you all listening to me and hope we have a really fruitful discussion. I have any questions, comments, reflections? Yes.
Cool. Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if there were any cases where a mentor wanted to talk about racism and the youth didn't want to talk about it with them or wasn't comfortable speaking with them about that?
Thank you. And what's your name?
Jessica.
Jessica, thank you for that question. So I didn't get any situations where that was reported. I actually had like 7 or 8 mentors report like, oh, I know this is important, but I don't feel comfortable talking about it. So I would rather just not talk about it at all than do harm, which is why I talked about the importance of social justice trainings. But some mentors just felt like they weren't equipped to have these specific conversations around race and racism. Any other questions, comments? Right here, and then we'll go to the back. What's your name? Ben? Yeah, nice to meet you.
One thing I noticed was you said a lot of mentors were white and white women in particular. Why do you think that is, and what could be, and is that a problem? And if so, what should be done to like recruit more mentors who share experiences with their mentees?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually shared the findings with some of the CEOs across the country, and this is a question that they're trying to answer. How do we recruit more diverse mentors? And then how do we make sure that specifically white women who do mentor are prepared to mentor, specifically if they've never interacted with this specific demographic before? So one thing I've suggested to a few different Big Brothers Big Sisters agencies is really taking a look at the requirements to be a mentor. So you have to pass a pretty strenuous background check. So for example, one of the mentors I talked to, he's kept in touch with his youth, who's now a grown man, for decades. And he's like, oh man, you've done so well in your life. Like, why can't you be a mentor? And the now grown man was saying, well, I have a felony on my record and like, I'm not allowed to mentor for Big Brothers Big Sisters. So I really encourage them to think about creative ways. If they can't be a mentor, can they be a part of the board? Can they be a part of a training? Can there be a mentoring event at the organization where they're able to speak and talk and provide their own life experiences? So I think that's the biggest thing, really looking at the criteria which people are allowed to be mentors and then kind of tweaking that to be a little bit more equitable. Yes. And what's your name?
Yeah,
All right.
my question was, have you had the opportunity to interview mentees to feel how they felt regarding their relationships with like specifically white mentors? And then just, if you haven't had that opportunity, kind of like what are the type of questions or things you'd like to uncover regarding that relationship?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I haven't done it with Black youth and Brothers Big Sisters, but for Friends of the Children, I actually have talked to some young adults who had white mentors. And it was really interesting. A lot of them talked about like how their Black mentor was really just as helpful as their white mentor, but in much different ways. So them being able to talk about racial issues was obviously different with the white mentor, which has made me think about the importance of having multiple mentors. Like I know I don't have one mentor in my life. I have multiple phenomenal people helping me out. So really thinking about what are ways that we can kind of utilize a multiple mentor system to help people have the most well-rounded support that they need. And I think that's important for not only racial identity, really anyone who's minoritized, but gender, sexual orientation, gender expression, all those things I think are very, very, very important. So the youth or young adults, they talked about the value of having mentors of both, but the conversations were different.
Questions online? Could I've got it if you just want to stand there. Amanda, would you like to ask your question? I'm gonna unmute you real quick.
Sure. I was wondering if there were future plans to look at other interracial mentee-mentor relationships. For example, in 2020, there was a lot of conversation about Asian American and African American communities and the different types of discrimination each of those communities experience in America.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was really interested in looking at, so the large majority of mentors I talked to were obviously white, but how were the conversations with, let's say, someone who identified as Latino and a Black youth? But for Big Brothers Big Sisters, the organizations I talked with, they tried to match you based upon your racial identity. And if they couldn't match you based upon that identity, it was more so like first come, first serve in terms of, because the mentoring waiting lists are so long. So instead of having someone wait for a year or two, they'll just give you a mentor. So I would love to look at that as a follow-up study. But that would take a lot of really specific and intentional recruitment, since those relationships seem to be a little bit more rare.
Another one online after that.
Okay. Can I get all the way in the back first?
Hi, Christina. Thank you for sharing your work today. And it prompted this wondering of, because of the close relationship that you developed with Big Brothers Big Sisters and your work here with Seattle-based organizations, do you know of any next steps that these organizations are taking as a result of your research, or even next steps that they're considering?
Yeah, the social justice trainings for sure. So I've been able to collaborate with some great people from across the country who specifically study what does a social justice training look like. So if you all look up Dr. Amy Anderson or Dr. Bernadette Sanchez, a lot of their work is around how do we best equip mentors to have difficult conversations with people who don't look like them. So a lot of our work has gone hand in hand, and we've worked with different agencies to try to implement those, or at least provide the recommendation.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Shan, would you like to ask your question now?
Yeah, so first off, thank you, Dr. Jones, for your presentation. My question was, are there any plans to look at how mentees from these programs are interested in or pursuing mentor roles themselves, whether it's in community or collegiate spaces?
I haven't, but that's a great follow-up. It is really interesting to think about specifically my work with Seattle Public Schools and Kingmakers specifically, and my work with the high school students, and how a lot of them have been able to pour back into the program, mentoring students. So I haven't studied that, but I would love to do that one day for sure. Yes.
I was just thinking about this fact that Big Brothers Big Sisters has a waiting list. And if you have thought about kind of utilizing that to kind of compare outcomes for students, or just talking to them about their reflections, just try to get at like what the mentors are doing, you know, kind of having a comparison group naturally.
Yeah, and what's your name?
Ellie.
Thank you for that. No, I haven't done that yet. But I wish I had a pen and paper so I could write that down. I appreciate that. Yeah, I would love to do that. I'm actually trying to receive more training. So qualitative becomes a lot more natural to me. I think it's like traumatic experiences as a middle school student. I'm kind of scared of numbers. So I'm really interested in like pushing myself and doing more quantitative studies, because there's some questions like that one that are specifically quantitative that I would love to answer. Any other questions, comments, any reflections, any thoughts? No, this brought up for anyone? Yes.
Lauren, I have a question related to one of the outcomes you mentioned. So you said that you hoped increasing connection. Oh wow, I really just blanked on that question. Sorry. I'm sorry, come back to me.
We can work on this together. So what are you saying?
Oh, sorry, it's gone.
We'll move back around. I think, what's your name? In the middle? Yes, yes. Tessie.
Thank you for the presentation. I was curious, you mentioned that the conversations with the Black boys were around policing, but not with the Black girls. I'm wondering what kinds of strategies the mentors were offering to Black girls and non-binary children.
So in terms of specific strategies to interact with police, which stem from oppression, that didn't come up with Black girls and non-binary folks. Which from like an intersectional lens is really important, thinking about how certain issues might be highlighted for Black men and might not come up for Black women. So for example, the school to prison pipeline is a huge issue for all youth, but Black girls are actually impacted in a very specific way from the school to prison pipeline, and that tends to be overlooked because of the hyper focus that Black boys get. So to me, it made me think of that sometimes Black girls, individuals who identify as young women can kind of feel invisible in some ways and being impacted by certain experiences that do impact them. They just don't have it discussed or brought up. But that alone would be a really fascinating follow-up study. So thank you for that. And I do 1 and then 2.
My name's Brittany. I'm in the sociology department. Thank you. This was very interesting. I have another question about gender. From what I remember, it seems like you found these gender differences between the gender of the mentee. But the gender of the mentor, I'm wondering if you found any strong differences, for example, in color blindness or things like that, that were more prevalent among like gender.
Yeah, so for the mentors who shared the same gender identity as the youth, specifically the male mentors I talked to is really interesting. They talked about like having to show examples of like, oh, this is how you be a man, you know, this is how you like, oh, this is how you like cut the grass, or like this is how you like do this or do that. So it's very like based in kind of like these male stereotypes. But for the men who did mentor Black youth, it kind of felt like, well, if I can't relate to you on race, like we're just really focused on like what being a man is like and being a positive male role model, which is really interesting. And again, that didn't come up as much with mentors who were female, who mentored youth that were female. Yes, do you have any other questions?
I'm Lizzie, I'm from the Evans School. And I'm curious, this would be like my professional bias, but like how your research makes you think about the role of the nonprofit sector in this world. Like, it seems like a lot of this mentoring is provided by organizations that sort of, need funding from the community and maybe are not like provided equitably across the nation necessarily. So is there more of like a public role that could be played through government in like supporting mentoring, or how does like the fact that mentoring is provided by nonprofits, I guess, affect experiences of mentors and mentees?
Yeah, that's a great question. So 2 quick stories. One of the mentors kind of identified that, just kind of like him having this newfound awareness and just kind of thinking like, well, how come we're not collaborating with other people in the youth lives? Well, how come the organization is doing all this work, but we're not working with like the local barbershop, or we're not trying to contribute resources to the school? I actually just wrote a recommendation for a book chapter, and that along with providing mentorship, which we started with the beginning, is really powerful, providing people with tangible resources. Because like I mentioned before, so many of the mentors were so displeased with the school that the youth went to. So one of the points that I didn't go into is just this sparking a lot of reflection within me is supportive trust and relationship. Is that enough to get the outcomes, to help people reach their full potential? And I think unless we really address the core issues, lack of resources, we might have some people who are able to make it out of their situation, but we still are kind of like giving them tools to fight a like battle that's unfair for them. So that's something I've been reflecting on a lot, and something I've been really vocal about on like different boards that I'm on. Yes.
Hi, my name is Nicole. I was just wondering, like, with the Big Brothers Big Sisters, I know that there's also like Boys and Girls Clubs, and like they offer programs like tutoring. Like, did you notice that there was any like academic like mentorship going on? Like you were just speaking about in that question, like if that like loving relationship isn't enough, like if there's something else that they need, are they able to opt into getting that from a mentor?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Big Brothers Big Sisters is really interesting in how they operate, whereas the mentor and the youth just kind of have like free reign to do whatever they want to do. And most of the activities are based around just kind of like hanging out and having fun. And it would be interesting to think about, well, what if Big Brothers Big Sisters and Boys and Girls Club like joined together, and one mentor focused on specifically exposing youth to certain activities, and then another mentor really focused on the academic enrichment part of it. So really being more intentional on how we utilize mentors is something that I think youth mentoring research is really starting to get into more heavily to produce better outcomes. And of course, people are more than outcomes, but the effect sizes can be so small that could be a reason. Like a supportive relationship is great, but when you have all these other things going on in their lives that isn't being addressed by the mentor relationship.
Hi, my name is Trayvon Mitchell. I'm a freshman at the University of Washington, studying the Fox School of Business. And my question is, for anybody that's trying to become a mentor, what is the crucial advice that you give to them trying to start out being a mentor?
Well, first, before I answer that, I gotta give you a shout out. So I met Trayvon a few years ago, and we talk about you learning from other people. I was just kind of blown away by his poise at his young age. Just kind of reflecting on like, dang, like if I was like that in high school, I imagine all the things I could have accomplished. So I say that to say, I think the biggest thing is just being yourself, just being authentic. I think for the young adults that I talked to who had a mentor who didn't share their racial identity, but still had a close bond with them, it was just having someone that you felt like had your best interest at heart, supported you no matter what, and you felt like they were authentically bringing themselves into the relationship. If it's not organic, if people don't feel like it's real, then it's just not going to work. That's like any relationship. So that's the biggest advice I would give, like just be yourself. Yes.
Thank you. So I remember my question. I was thinking about the reframing of the mentor-mentee relationships is helpful to the mentor also. And I'm wondering how you think emphasizing that might change relationship dynamics to increase outcomes or positive outcomes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That would be a really great study. Because on one hand, I think it could help with recruitment of mentors. But on the other hand, I would hate for people to come in with a predatory mindset, like, oh, I'm gonna get all this stuff out of it. And, I'm kind of like awkward and I'm gonna do this and I'm gonna do this out of it. So I don't know, honestly. That's something that I would love to explore further. Because I think that's such a nuanced question. We'd have to get together afterwards and like figure out like what specific outcomes and how we would measure it and how we would look at it. But I think you're hitting on something like really important. Like we know that mentors benefit from the relationship as well, but it has to be organic and it can't come from a place where, especially in that situation, the mentor is the person who has the power. So really thinking about equitable ways to promote these really positive outcomes. So yeah, I would love to think about that some more. Y'all have been great. I feel like I've been up here talking like 20 minutes. Any other questions, reflections? Just thoughts from the presentation? Yes.
Hi, I'm Cami. I thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation and this work broadly. This is maybe like a more logistical question, but I'm curious, when you recruited for this study, did you advertise that it was going to be focused on social justice and exploring interracial relationships? Just thinking about the kinds of people that maybe like opted into participating versus those who may not have.
Yeah, for sure. Well, one, is just great to meet you in person.
You too.
Second, I was pretty upfront with everything and specifically around what the study would be about, specific people I was looking for the study. And I sent out the interview guide beforehand so people like knew what they were getting themselves into. And it is interesting, like I definitely probably got people who got had very positive experiences. Like when I say people would tell stories during these interviews that could make you cry, that were very inspiring, just some really powerful stuff. And I'm sure if someone had a very negative experience, they would be less likely to share that, especially with a stranger. So there's actually some really good youth mentoring research that looks at why relationships fail. That's really interesting. And then one of those many themes of that research is that cultural disconnect and then being able to bridge that disconnect. I love you, though, man. Like y'all are just interactive and fun.